Hey, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about Google Cloud Functions. So this is a service provided by Google that lets me write a function in my language of choice, whether that language is Node.js, Python, Ruby, Java, .NET, and it lets me write that function and put it up in Google Cloud. Not only that, it is serverless, which means I don't need to SSH into a server like I did in my last Linode video. I just have this code that runs in the cloud and I don't really have to do a lot of management. I can trust it to execute whenever I run it. And one nice thing about Google Cloud Functions, as you can see here on the pricing page, is it's really cheap. You can actually invoke this. It looks like you can invoke it millions of times for absolutely free, so you don't need to even pay $5 a month. So if you just have a simple use case where you need to write a function that runs over and over again, whether it's for like a Discord bot or a Slack bot or a TradingView webhook, for instance, this seems like a pretty good solution. And it's very similar to AWS Lambda functions, which I talked about in my TradingView webhook video, where I used a framework called AWS Chalice. So today, I'm going to talk about how to write one of these Google Cloud functions. I'm going to make a very basic Google Cloud function that buys and sells stock. And I'm just going to use Alpaca since it's an easy API we can use to buy and sell stock, and it's free to sign up. But I'll also write some other functions in the next videos to trade using other exchanges and brokers. So I'll probably write a function for Binance, maybe Coinbase, FTX, and Tradier, some of the other brokerages that I like to use. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started with exploring Google Cloud Functions and seeing how to write them. And so with Google Cloud Functions, you click and you can go to the console here. So I'm at cloud.google.com and I have a Google Cloud account and I have a couple projects in it. I use this for my newsletter trading bot that I wrote in the last video. And so I'm going to create a new project here. And so the first thing you need to do is create a new project. So I'm going to call it Trading Functions, and that'll just be the name of my project. And I can click Create. Okay, and that'll go ahead and start initializing a project. And the next thing I'm going to do is Google Cloud Functions allows you to actually write some functions in the browser. But what I'm going to do is use this functions framework. So Google Cloud Platform has something called the Functions Framework. And this lets me test my Google Cloud Functions locally on my desktop. So we can develop it there, similar to how we would develop a Flask or basic Python web application. We can run it locally, test it out locally, and then we can deploy it to the cloud. So I'm going to click this Functions Framework here. I'm going to scroll down, and since I'm interested in Python, notice that it supports several languages. We do Python typically on this channel, and I'm going to go to the Functions Framework for Python, and we're just going to go ahead and set this up. So you can see all you need to do is write a simple Python function, and it will get a parameter or an input called the request. And that request can have a message, so like a JSON message that you post to this function. That way you can send it different data, and then you just need to return a response. So you just need to do whatever you want inside the function and then return a response to the client that invoked the function. And so let's figure out how to use this real quick. So this says just we need to install the Functions Framework. So I'm going to go to a new Visual Studio Code editor. So I'm going to open a new window here, and we're going to start a fresh project and write a Google Cloud function to buy and sell stock, and then I'm going to deploy it to Google Cloud. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it Google Cloud Functions Alpaca, and we'll create several iterations of this using other brokers. Okay, so I have a new folder here, and then it says all I need to do is create a file called main.py. So it says create a file called main.py. And I'll do that. And then it says just put a basic Python function inside. So I'm going to put a function called hello world, just like that. And I'm going to try to run this. Okay, so that doesn't do anything just running it. But what I need to do is set up this functions framework. So I use pip to install that. So the Python package manager. And so I have my environment here. And so in this terminal, in whatever terminal you use, I'm going to install functions framework using pip. And that'll install the functions framework. Once I have that framework set up, what I can do is run the function. So if you look here, you see you just need to run the functions framework command. and you give it a target of the function that you're executing. Okay, so I'm going to take this and run functions framework dash dash target equals, and since my function is named hello, I'm going to type hello. Okay, and what that's going to do is run this function locally on a server. And so you can't see what's happening here, so I'm going to stop that real quick, and I'm going to do dash dash debug. So if you look here, it has dash dash debug, and that'll let you actually see what's happening. So it'll write a log to your screen, so you'll see what's actually happening, and it'll also reload the program every time you make a change. So I'm going to do target hello. So I'm going to do dash dash target hello, and I'm going to do dash dash debug. Okay, so let's run it like that. So you'll notice in the console now, I'm running a local server at my local host, and it's at port 8080. And so if I go to my browser and go to localhost 8080, you'll see I get hello world right there. So I'll get hello world because that's what's returned from that function. And so now let's go ahead and just return, we can return a dictionary and it'll automatically convert it to JSON. So I'll do code success. Okay, so we'll just return a success code. If I run that, you see I get a little response that says code success. So very handy. So now instead of calling this hello, let's call it something else. So I'm going to call it trade stock. And we're just going to modify this function until it actually trades stock, and then we're going to deploy that to the cloud. Okay, so you see that stock because I changed the name of the function, and now I'm going to call the target trade stock and run it like that, and you see that it still works. So now let's put some code inside to actually trade stock. So I'm going to go to Alpaca. So I have Alpaca here. Sign up for an account if you don't have one already, if you want to follow along. And I'm going to create an API key real quick. So I'm going to create a new one for my paper trading account. And I'm going to get this URL here. So we're going to use paper trading, and I'm going to get my Alpaca API key and secret key. So let's review how to make a trade using the Alpaca API. If I search for Alpaca Trade API Python, you get this little library here, and all we need to do is pip install Alpaca Trade API. So I'm going to get that right there. So I'll do pip install Alpaca Trade API, and I'll get the Trade API package right there. And then once that's done, I just need to make a new instance of the Trade API REST client. So you see they import Alpaca Trade API as Trade API. So I'll do that. So at the top here, I'll import Alpaca Trade API as Trade API. So now that I've imported the Trade API here, I can just create a new instance of it. So I'm going to do API equals a trade API.rest. So there's this object I can instantiate, and I need to pass it my API key, my secret key, and the base URL. And so I have these already, so I will just I'm going to assign these to variables real quick. So I'll call that base URL. I'll call this API key, and I'll call this secret key. Okay, and then I will pass those in as 3 parameters: API key, secret key, and base URL. And once that's done, I have an instance of the Alpaca Trade API, and I could do API dot, and then I have a function called submit order. Okay, and this accepts a number of parameters. So I need a symbol, a quantity, a side. So I'm going to do a symbol. Let's just do Apple, quantity of 8 shares, a side. We can do buy, and then we can do, we need a type and a time and force. So the type can be market or limit. So I'll just do market, and then the time and force, I'll do GTC for good till canceled. And I know I'm going through this kind of fast because I've used Alpaca so many times on this channel. And so I'm going to store the result of this call to submit order in a variable called order. And let's just see what happens. So I'll print order to the screen here. And let's see. Let's rerun our functions framework. So I'm going to do functions framework. Target is trade stock, since that's the name of the function. And I'll keep debugging. Okay. So let's see what happens if I submit the URL. Does this work? So I'm going to hit my localhost URL. And it didn't throw an error, so maybe it did work. So I'm going to look in here. I printed the order object, and you see I indeed submitted an order. And if I go to the Alpaca console here, you should be able to see. Let's see if I ordered some stock. So I'm going to check it down here, and you see I have a market buy for Apple stock for 8 shares. That was accepted, which is great. So we successfully submitted an order from a Google Cloud function, albeit it's one that I'm running locally on my machine. I haven't deployed it to the cloud yet. Okay, so I'm not quite happy with this function yet. What's the limitation of it, right? You can see I've hard-coded Apple in there. I've hard-coded 8 shares, and that it's a buy at market and so forth, right? And so how do I actually send it different parameters? So let's say if I want to buy Microsoft stock, I still want to use the same function here. So what I'll do here is this request input allows me to control the input that comes into that function, and then I can use those inputs as inputs to the submit order function. Okay, so let's look at the Google Cloud function documentation real quick. And so if I look at Google Cloud functions and how they look in Python, and let's just see the quick example that they show us here. So you see in their quick start example, they show request JSON equals request.getJSON. So I can actually submit a JSON message or a JSON payload to this function and then parse out those values into a Python dictionary, and then we can process that request. And so what I'm going to do is take this request.getJSON, right? And so for our request, we can say, I'm going to call this data equals request.getJSON. And so I'm going to post some type of request and get that data here. Okay, and I'll print that data just to show what it looks like. And so to test this locally, I'm going to use Insomnia, which is a REST client or an API client that I've used previously on this channel, and I used it in a very recent video. So if you look up Insomnia REST client, there's this free, easy to use graphical client where you can test API requests. Okay, so I've downloaded that and used it, and it's free. And so I'm running this locally on my machine, and it looks like this when you start it up. And what I can do is do create, and I'm going to create a request collection, and I'm going to call this test Google Cloud functions. Okay, and I'm going to test out this Google Cloud function by creating a new request. I'm going to hit that plus. I'm going to go to new request, and then trade stock function. Okay, so I'm going to do a trade stock function test. And I'm going to do a post request because I'm posting data to the function, and I'm going to pick a type of JSON. So I'm posting a JSON body to this URL, and so the URL that I'm posting to is localhost 8080. Okay, so I'm going to post to localhost 8080, and now let's format some JSON. So I'm going to put some data is the key, and then some value is the value. And if I send this, I still get my success response on the right side. And then if I look in my console here at my function, you can see it submitted another order, and you can see where I printed some data and some value, right? So that worked pretty well. So I'm able to get data from an HTTP request that I submitted. And so now let's go ahead and make our own data format that lets us adjust these parameters. So instead of Apple right here, I'm going to do data, and I'll call it symbol, and then I'll call it a data quantity, and I'll do a data side, and I'll do data order type, and then I'll do data, what is that, time in force. Okay, and so for my data here, I'm going to format this in such a way that I use all of those keys. So symbol, quantity, side, order type, quantity, and then I'll put like 3 there. Side is by, and then the order type, and let's just do market. So quotes market, and then the time in force, I'm going to do good till canceled, right? And then my symbol, I'll do, let's do NVIDIA. Okay, so I'm going to do 3 shares of NVIDIA. And let's see if I can dynamically send in a request and have it make the order. So I'm going to click that. It still says success, which is good. And if I check my Alpaca console and look at my order history, let me see if I can refresh. you see that I have this market buy order for NVIDIA stock. And then I could also modify this again and do Netflix, right? And let's do a sell. So I'll do sell 10 shares of Netflix, which I don't have 10 shares of Netflix. So I'm going to click that. And now I triggered an error. And you see it says API error invalid side. And so I need to do it with lowercase. Okay, so I'm going to click that. And it says success. So I submitted an order for Netflix. And it looks like I did have 10 shares of Netflix. So that didn't cause an error. And so I'm going to submit to sell 100 shares of Netflix. And then that gave me an error, insufficient quantity available for the order. And you see how it dumped this really ugly debugging error. Usually I'm going to be requesting this endpoint from a mobile app or a web application, right? And so I need this data, this error message returned in a useful format that's easy to parse. And so instead of just dumping this stack trace on the screen, we need to handle this error. And so I'm going to do a try catch. So I'm going to catch this exception. So I'm going to do try, and then I'm going to do accept exception as E. And then let's go ahead and return some type of error. So instead of returning code success, if there's any exceptions, we're going to return a code of error. And then we can return some type of message of what that error is. So I'm going to do, I'm going to convert that exception to a string, and let's see what that does. So I'm going to run that, and I'm going to submit this again. And now you see we have this nice JSON response that says error, insufficient quantity available for order. And then now we know what the message is, we know what the error message is. And then whatever client we use to call our API, we can format this error message in a nice way for the end user, right? So we'll display it in red or something and display it in a clean way where it's easy for the user to understand what they did wrong. And then likewise, we're just returning a generic success message here. But what I want to do, since I have this order object returned, what I want to do is maybe we want to store the order ID. So since it returns an ID here, I will return an order ID, and that's order.id. And I'll also return the status. So I'll do order. We have this order.status, okay? And so maybe if we're making some bot or trading system, we want to return the order ID and the status so that we can check it later. And so maybe we want to store this order ID in a database, or maybe we want to check on the filled price for the order. And so a lot of this information is useful. So right now I'm just going to return this basic information, and let me see if I can do another buy. So I'm going to buy some AT&T stock. So I'll submit that. You see I have an order ID and that it was accepted. And then you see I have my market buy order of AT&T. So that's great. We have this nice function working already, and we're sending it JSON data and getting a nice JSON response. So how do I make this even better? What else do I want to do to this? So one thing I want to do here is I don't like my API key and a secret key living in the main program here. So I'm going to create a file. I usually create a config.py file or store these keys somewhere else. And so what I'll do is take these out. I'm going to copy those into config.py. Okay. And then I'm going to import config. And then now, instead of just API key, I'll do config.api key, config.secret key, and config.base URL. And that just makes my program a little bit cleaner. Okay. And then the last thing I'll do, I don't want people just invoking this function with there's no protection here, right? Anyone that has this URL that has access can execute this URL and post this and make orders. And so I'm just going to put a simple way of authenticating this now, and maybe we'll add a more complex authentication layer. We'll look up what Google provides for this. So if they provide some type of API key or other way of authenticating these requests. For now, I'll just use like some secret string I come up with. So I'm going to make a passphrase, and we'll call that secret phrase 123. And then inside of my main function, what we can do is require the user to pass in some type of passphrase in the request here. And if they don't have that, then they don't have permission. So we'll have this secret passphrase that's required. So you see where we get the request JSON here, what I'll do is see if the key passphrase is in the data, and no, I'll say if a passphrase is not in data, so if they didn't provide a passphrase, or the data's passphrase does not equal my config.passphrase, right? So if they didn't pass a passphrase, or they did pass a passphrase and it's not the one in my config file, then I'm going to return an error. And so I'll return a dictionary that says code error, and then I'll say a message, you are unauthorized, right? And technically we could return a forbidden, like an HTTP response of 403, which means HTTP forbidden status code. I'm just going to return a JSON message like this for now. And so I'm going to submit that now. And you see now, since I didn't pass a passphrase, I'm unauthorized. So I can add a passphrase into my JSON here. And so I'll do ABC123. I submit it. I'm still unauthorized. But if I know the secret passphrase, secret phrase 123, so I'll do secret phrase 123, then it actually executes the order. So now I've created this nice function here. We have a config file with our keys and our passphrase, and we're able to make different orders depending on how the request is submitted. So pretty happy with that. So let's see if we can deploy this to the cloud now. So I'm going to go back to my Google Cloud here. And so you'll remember earlier I created that project called Trading Functions. And so the first thing I need to do here, there's one step, is I need to look for Build API in the search box. And there's this Cloud Build API. And so in order to deploy these functions to Google Cloud, I need to enable this Cloud Build API. And once that's done, I'll actually be able to go to Google Cloud Functions and deploy them. So now I can go down here, and I'm going to scroll down to Cloud Functions, just like this. And it says Google Cloud Functions is getting ready. And so note, I believe this functions framework lets you deploy from the command line. So I should be able to type some special command like gcloud deploy or something like that to deploy this Google Cloud function, right? But that requires installing extra stuff. I'll do that in a follow-up video. So what I'm going to do is just use the user interface now that I've tested this locally. And so I'm going to go to my Cloud Functions. I'm going to click Create Function there, and I'll call this Alpaca Trades. So I'll call it Alpaca Trade as my function name. I'm deploying this to the US Central region. I can click and select other regions. I'm going to trigger it with an HTTP request, so a web request. And I'm going to say allow unauthenticated invocations. I'm just going to use my passphrase authentication for now. Technically, I can use Google Cloud's Identity Access Management Service, but I haven't studied that yet. I'll talk about that when I learn more about it. And I'm going to say require HTTPS. So I'm going to require a secure connection in order to make this post request. I'm going to click Save here, and I'm going to go to Next. And then this gives me a little editor for my Google Cloud function. So technically, I didn't have to edit that function locally. I could have just written it right in here, but it's kind of hard to write your code inside of a web form. So I wrote it locally first, and then I can just put the code in here. So by default, it shows this Node.js version. So if you're interested in writing in JavaScript, you could use this one, but I'm going to do Python, and you can select any version. These are all fine. I'll just do 3.8, and I have a main.py here. And then locally, we developed a main.py already. So I'm just going to copy this right in and see if it works. So I have that. And then I can click plus, and I'll just create my config py right here. Okay. And let's see if we can take that, and we'll throw this into Google Cloud. So just like that. And then my requirements.txt. This is where I put any dependencies. So locally, I installed Alpaca Trade API, but Google Cloud doesn't have a copy of that. So we need to put our list of dependencies in, right? And so since I installed Google Alpaca Trade API, I need to put that here as in my list. And so if I installed, Pandas TA or any of these other libraries, I just put all those listed in this requirements text file. But we only have one dependency for this particular program. So I put Alpaca Trade API, in requirements text. I put my keys in my config.py, and then I have my main code in my main.py. And yeah, let's go ahead and click deploy. And actually, I've already noticed one thing I did wrong. It has entry point by default is hello world, but my function is called trade stock. So I expect this deployment is probably going to fail. And so that's fine though, because that gives us a chance to talk about the log files and how to check if things go wrong. So you see it's trying to deploy it right now. And if I click on the name of the function there, you can see there's this tab called logs. You can see a lot of metrics here on the function. So you can see as soon as we get this deployed, if you want to monitor this function, right? Let's say we're using this as a trading view webhook, or we have a web application or mobile application that's using this cloud function. We want to see and be able to monitor the users that are using this function and see if anything's going wrong. We want to see if, maybe it's using a lot of memory, or this is being accessed too frequently. Maybe we want to make some adjustments to the runtime environment. Okay. I can also click around and see some details. So maybe we want to allocate more memory based on some of these metrics, right? We can see the source code, obviously, and it looks like you can create some environment variables here. So now I'm thinking it's probably the best practice to create some environment variables here for those API keys. So that's something I'll try later as well. So I'm just learning this as I go and just showing you what I learn as I go. So I'm just doing this very iteratively, and then I'll keep following up with videos as I find out better and better practices here. So we can probably define some environment variables for these config values that I put in, such as the passphrase and the API key. So that's something I'll look into as well. And this is the web address where I can invoke the function. So since I'm no longer using localhost in Insomnia, it looks like I can just use this web address right here. And then in my Insomnia, when I want to test it, I'm going to go to HTTPS, and this is the address to my cloud function. And hopefully, whenever I hit this endpoint, it's going to make trades exactly the same way when it's running in the cloud. Looks like there's some permissions that I can control here. So I'll see if I can figure out more information about that. And then here are my logs. And so now I'm in my logs, and you can see it failed to deploy. And I look at my logs, and I can see main.py is expected to contain a function named hello world. So I didn't call the function hello world. So I'm going to go back here to my entry point. So let's see in my source. Let's see if I can edit this entry point real quick. I'm going to click edit. And I'm going to go to next. And instead of hello world, I'm going to do trade stock as my entry point. And then I'll try to redeploy this and see if it works. So I'm going to go back to my logs here. So I'm going to click on the function name. I'll go to logs, and let's see if this thing will actually deploy. And so while that's running, I'm going to have a drink here. By the way, been trying these cocktails in a can lately. So that's one called Salt Point. Can you see that? Yeah, so you can get like a highball. You can get like anything. You can get a margarita in a can. You can get like a rum and coke in a can now. So it's kind of crazy the food and drink technology these days that you can just get this in a can, bring it to the park, and have a drink. So been enjoying trying out these different hard seltzers, and they've also been a great investment lately. Like there's a Sam Adams stock, right? So if you check out Sam Adams stock, this thing really ran right from 300 to like 1,200 a share, and that's because I think they own hard seltzer. What do they own? They don't own White Claw. They own Truly hard seltzer. And so, yeah, this has been kind of a hot thing. Everyone's into these hard seltzers these days. But anyway, I've been trying some of them, and they've been pretty good. I tried this one called Cutwater. That's pretty good as well. And so look at that. I have a green check mark now, and it says version 2 is deployed. So I think this thing might be in the cloud now. So let's check it out. I copied the URL. I copied the trigger URL already, right? So that's it. And then I put this in my post here, and let's try something. So I'm going to order some Tesla here, and I'm going to do 50 shares, and I'm going to click buy, and let's see if this goes. And it says that it accepted. And if I go to Alpaca here, you see, let's see what went down. Let's see if I can refresh it and go to my orders, and there's a Tesla market buy for 50 shares. And we have deployed a Google Cloud function that buys and sells stocks, which is great. And now we can really build upon this and use Google Cloud Functions more. It seems pretty easy to use. And let me see if I can update my TradingView strategy alert webhooks videos. So maybe I'll make one of those that executes this cloud function. And I'll also see in the next video if I can run a Google Cloud function on a schedule. So maybe we'll have a Google Cloud function that grabs data on a schedule and then applies an indicator and makes buys and sells. And so maybe we can have our entire trading system living in these Google Cloud functions. So excited to explore this a little bit more and see what else is possible. But for now, I just wanted to show a simple example of how to create a Google Cloud function, locally test it, and deploy it to the cloud. So hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one.